I'm really excited to have Dr. Jonathan Likeke Shoyer with us today to talk about his work. Dr. Shoyer was born and raised in Manoa, Oahu, Hawaii. His firm Kahalawai Consulting helps organizations manage environmental conflict with the goal that they, their stakeholders, and the natural resources involved will all enjoy sustainable prosperity. Works particularly on issues that intersect environmental concerns and Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian rights. He's worked in the resolution of complex water disputes, the closure of conservation real estate acquisitions. He's advised fiduciary boards and policy development and facilitated meetings on climate science and adaptation. His first book, Water and Power in West Maui, co-authored with Dr. Bianca Isaki, was published by UH Press in 2021. As a volunteer, he serves as the chair of the Hawaii State Land Use Commission, a unique statewide zoning body, the immediate past chair of the Hawaii Land Trust, and chair of the political committee of the Sierra Club Hawaii chapter. He is also a lecturer in law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, and previous work as a volunteer has been on the board of Malama Manoa and as a Konamoku representative and vice chair of the Oahu Island Burial Council. He holds a bachelor's and PhD from UC Santa Cruz and a master's from the Yale School of Environment, all in environmental studies. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Shoyer.
Aloha, and thank you very much for that nice introduction and for putting this together. So I really appreciate the invitation to speak to the WRRC. I think despite the fact that I've been working on water issues in Hawaii 30 years, this was the first time I got invited, so I was super happy to receive the invitation. I have some sense of the people who are here, and there's people I can see still piling in. I'll start by noting that what I'm offering today is really a synthetic talk. So I'm going to be touching on different things, and there's people in the room, I can guarantee you, who know more deeply about certain things that I'm talking about than I do. But I'm trying to bring a bunch of disparate things together to get an overall view of how we're approaching sustainable yield in Hawaii and maybe some ways that we can improve. I hope that everybody in the talk finds something that's useful for them, even if some of it for you will think, oh man, this is really basic. In one sentence, or a couple sentences, here's really what I want to leave today with and what I'll try and spend the hour getting to. Sustainable yields that are set using the robust analytical model are useful as far as an overall outer limit of possible consumption. However, we need to become far better at recognizing that there are more uses that need sustaining and more people that need to be engaged in the process of defining what it is we want to sustain. We need to then bring to bear better modeling, better planning, and better policies to help sustain the precious places and people of Hawaii. So to get where I'm going, there's four main parts to my talk. First, I'll say a little bit more about my professional background, as well as give some legal and relevant policy background, I think, to understand the context of sustainable yield in Hawaii. Then I'll delve a little bit deeper into how the current use of the robust analytical model-based sustainable yields are utilized in water management in Hawaii. Then I'll talk about at least two, hopefully three places where there's ongoing discussion of what's the correct sustainable yield for this area and what those discussions kind of reveal. And finally, I'll try to answer or start to answer a question. So what do we do? So hopefully this conversation and this presentation today actually leads to greater conversations about sustainable yield and better and more sustainable water management in Hawaii. So I said I would say a little bit more about my professional and legal background, the sections in this first of the four parts of my talk. I'll talk about my professional background. I want to then talk about, for some of you who know this well, I apologize, but some might not know it. What is the origin of the public trust in water in Hawaii? Uses that the public trust is protecting, how the public trust is supposed to be protected. And particularly, I'll go into guidance from the Hawaii Supreme Court from the Kauai Springs case. And then I'll highlight some other key characteristics of Hawaii water policy that are critical background to understanding how sustainable yield is implemented. So about my background, as Aurora shared, this year I published my first book, co-authored with Bianca Isaki, about water and power in West Maui. It is indeed grounded in disputes in the history of water in West Maui, but really it is a book about water development and water management in Hawaii in general. My background includes work with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, with Kamehameha Schools, and as a consultant, I used to primarily focus entirely on surface water issues, working with communities, especially in communities in the Waiha, seeking to have Molokai stream flow restored. But for the past few years, 11 years, I've been working with the National Park Service to try and manage and protect Molokai groundwater flow in West Hawaii, secure groundwater for the Department of Fine Homelands around the islands, as well as surface water. And I've even had some other clients, including farmers, a golf course, and others who want to utilize water, but do so in a sustainable way. Aurora's mentioned my volunteer work, and I just want to highlight part of my motivation for really understanding what I should have understood a long time ago about how groundwater is managed comes from both writing the book and serving on the State Land Use Commission, where we often get very simplistic explanations of whether a proposed development is sustainable when it comes to its water resources. My grounding, and I really think everybody's grounding in how water management should be sustained in Hawaii, or how water should be managed in Hawaii, needs to start with understanding the origin and scope of the public trust in water in Hawaii. Now, there's entire classes, including taught by Kapua Sprode at the law school, that spend an entire semester going over the history of Hawaii water law, and I'm going to try and do it in one slide. And the basic is this: we've kind of gone in a circle. So in ancient Hawaii, nobody owned water. Water was held, really understood in a traditional sense, and this is in Handy's and Pukui's book, Native Planters of Old Hawaii. They talk about the water, if it was a possession at all, was a possession of the gods. The ali'i, or the mo'i, was there as a trustee of that resource on behalf of the people. And that historical and cultural understanding of water as a trust resource continued through the mahele. The legislature, the mo'i, and other bodies at the time of the mahele from 1848 to 1852 were really explicit. They said, we're taking this huge step and we're privatizing land in Hawaii, but we're not privatizing water. Water is going to be continued to be held by the kingdom for everybody's benefit. Now, what happened is the growth of the plantations and large ranches and the infiltration of those economic powers into leadership and government in Hawaii, and particularly into Hawaii's Supreme Court, was that we started to get a whole bunch of legal decisions, starting particularly during the Republic of Hawaii period and into the territory, that started both in the law and on the ground to treat water like private property that could be bought and sold. And this practice continued and solidified all the way until the 1970s, when a series of legal cases, sometimes referred to as the McBride cases or the Hanapepe cases, challenged that entire understanding. And in the decision under the leadership of William S. Richardson, for whom our law school is named, they went back and they said, actually, all you people who are claiming you own this water, you're wrong. Water is held in trust by the state as the successor sovereign, but not as its property to be bought and sold, but in trust for everybody's benefit. That legal ruling led to some chaos. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. And eventually led to the adoption of constitutional amendments in 1978 at the Constitutional Convention, the adoption of the Water Code by the state legislature in 1987, and then a whole series of court rulings which clarified the nature and the scope of the public trust of water in Hawaii. So what is the public trust supposed to protect? Really briefly, the many court cases that have ensued since passage of the Water Code, first and most notably the Waiahole water case, which I wrote my doctoral dissertation about, but also court cases on Molokai about the impact of groundwater development on traditional and customary practices and DHHL rights, court cases in the Waiha, court cases on Kauai, and other cases have given us greater interpretation than existed in the bare Water Code of what our dual mandate of both protection and use entails. So 4 things have been identified as by the courts of Hawaii, by the Hawaii Supreme Court, as public trust uses of water. First, and not in any priority order, but just how they're often listed, water left in its natural state to support ecosystems. Water used in the exercise of traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights, sometimes referred to as T&C rights. water used by and reserved for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and the domestic water needs of the general public. And I put an asterisk next to this so that highlight for folks who might not know, there's some ongoing debate over exactly what domestic needs of the general public means. And to map out the extremes of that argument, some people says it means water in anybody's house, no matter how they get it. And other people say it's only a protection of people with their individual wells or individual stream diversions. Nonetheless, these are the 4 public trust uses of water. So how are the public trust uses of water in Hawaii supposed to be protected? In a very rough level, on a very high level summary, the short version is this. The job of any entity that's affecting the allocation of water, whether state or county, is to ensure there's sufficient water for public trust uses before any non-public trust uses are allocated. But the courts have gone into some greater detail on exactly how this is supposed to be done by agencies. And so there's a long version that comes to us from a court case on the island of Kauai called the Kauai Springs case. And they offered, for everybody's benefit, what I refer to as a 3-part analytical framework for how you decide whether or not a water use should be allowed. And I'll just say a little bit about this case because it was interesting. There was a private water bottler on private land who was seeking to expand their uses of, they want to produce more bottled water. So they went to the Kauai Planning Commission for a series of permits that they needed for their land uses. But partially at the suggestion of local folks on Kauai, the Planning Commission started to say, are we possibly harming a public trust use of water if we allow them their land use permits, which are going to expand their bottling water use? They asked the Water Commission for guidance. The Water Commission essentially declined to give them further guidance. After a series of proceedings, the Planning Commission on Kauai denied the permits. And they said, we think that you might be impacting public trust uses of water. We're going to deny your permits. This got appealed to the Circuit Court and the Intermediate Court of Appeals all the way to the Hawaii Supreme Court. And the Hawaii Supreme Court used this as an occasion to not just uphold the Kauai Planning Commission, but to lay out and summarize Hawaii water law to that point. So they laid out this 3-part test. First job is determine if the proposed use is for one of the 4 public trust purposes: protection and maintenance of ecosystems, protection or use in traditional and customary practices, uses for, by, or reservations for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, or the domestic uses of the general public. That's the first test. The second test is if it's inconsistent. So if it's not one of those 4 public trust uses, you have to do a few things. First, determine what your actual needs are, not what your desired needs are, but what is your actual need that you need in order to pursue this use. Next, to determine whether or not the proposed use is reasonable and beneficial. And these are legal terms of art with court cases helping to interpret them very briefly and roughly. Reasonable means, are you being efficient with the use of water? Is your proposed use twice what a similar use does? And is it beneficial, which has been defined in different ways and is often referred to, is the proposed use of water in compliance with existing state and county and federal policies. Third, are there practicable alternatives? And that's another debated term. But are you taking water from a stream because it's cheaper? Or are you taking water from a stream because it's the only possible place you can take it, or groundwater? And is there a reasonable allegation of harm to other public trust uses of water? If there's a reasonable allegation of harm, then you have a separate duty. So it doesn't say anybody who just says, hey, I don't like that, I think you're harming us, that's not good enough. But if there's a reasonable allegation, what has to happen? That's the third thing. So if your proposed use is inconsistent with trust purposes, there's no practicable alternative, and yet it's reasonable and beneficial, the applicant has to do something. They have to implement reasonable measures to mitigate the cumulative impact of existing and proposed diversions on the trust purposes. Now, what might those mitigations look like? It could look like we're going to increase efficiency over time. We're going to invest in water reuse in our project. We're going to spend money on watershed protection. We're going to provide water for the Department of Hawaiian Homelands or other public trust purposes. That's the basic framework that all water allocations in Hawaii, regardless of whether it's from surface or ground and regardless of what island it's on, are supposed to follow. Now, with that, I just want to point out a few other things about Hawaii water law and policy that are important to keep in mind. And you could say we have a lot of confining layers in Hawaii water policy. Things that are connected, should be connected, but are kept separate. Surface water is regulated differently than groundwater, both because of judicial precedent, but even down to the staff members who actually monitor and enforce and regulate permits. The Water Commission, or the Commission on Water Resources Management, whose a previous version of them is on the photo here, they are in charge of permitting water. Leasing water, which is sometimes done by BLNR, is done by the Board of Land Natural Resources, a separate entity. The Water Commission regulates the amount of water that you can take, but delivery is done by either private or public purveyors. Water allocation is done by the Water Commission. Water rates are set by either the county water utilities or by private utilities regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And in those rates, we all pay in our bills money to maintain the built infrastructure to deliver water to us. Wells, tanks, pipelines, the people who take care of them. But we actually don't, as a part of our water rates, regularly pay the natural infrastructure of our ecosystems, of our stream sides, of our nearshore environment, of our watersheds to maintain those. The Water Commission regulates quantity, the Department of Health regulates quality. And finally, the last big division, and probably the most significant division in how we manage water in Hawaii, is designated versus non-designated water management areas. This map shows for groundwater, the designated water management areas in the state. Everything in blue is designated, everything in green is non-designated. So all groundwater in Molokai, most on Oahu, except for Waianae, the Iau aquifer of Maui. Everything else is non-designated. For surface water, the only designated surface water management area is the surface water management area of Nawaiʻeha in central Maui. Now, what's the difference between a designated and an undesignated water management area? There's really just one big difference, but it has nuances and important differences. In all areas of the state, if you want to develop groundwater, you need to get a well construction and a pump installation permit. In addition, in a designated water management area, you need to get a water use permit. Now, the first of these permits, the well construction and pump installation permits, not always, but often and usually the Water Commission treats these permits as ministerial. And if you don't have a legal background and not sure what ministerial means that if you turn in an application and as long as it meets all the legal requirements, you automatically get the permit. Water use permits are not actually treated as ministerial. For a water use permit, you actually have to notice your permit in the paper after it's been deemed as complete. Anybody can object to it. If they're found to have standing, well, they can then ask for a contested case hearing at a hearing that's held after it's been objected to. A contested case hearing is a quasi-judicial hearing where people can call witnesses and cross-examine other parties and introduce evidence. And it can take what could be a 90-day process into a multi-year process. That said, the vast majority of water use permits in the state are awarded without objection and are awarded. People apply, it's noticed in the paper, nobody objects, they're awarded. That's the big difference between designated and undesignated management areas. And the significance of all this is as follows. The courts have made it really clear. The state has an obligation to protect public trust use of water everywhere. Surface, ground, designated, undesignated. The state, particularly the Water Commission, doesn't have clear administrative processes for filling that obligation, particularly as it relates to groundwater outside of designated water management areas. And the implementation of sustainable yield plays a role on that. So we're done with the first of the 4 parts of my talk. And the next part is going to be about the current role of robust analytical yield, or RAM-based sustainable yield in water management. I'm going to go over a little bit of the water code and how hydrologic units and sustainable yield are defined in the code. I'm going to step off a little bit and talk about the origins of the sustainable yield concept, then how they are implemented through the Hawaii Water Plan, talk about some related relevant management practices that the state uses. I'm going to talk about limits to RAM, including the limits to RAM that the Water Commission openly and willingly talks about. Talk about the things that RAM-driven sustainable yield does very well for us in Hawaii, and then some current shortcomings. So the Hawaii Water Code, I talked about it a little bit. It was passed in 1978. or as mandated by the 1978 constitutional amendments, particularly Article 11, Section 1, which declares all publicly owned natural resources are held in trust. So it reified our legal history from the kingdom. And Article 7, which calls for the establishment of water regulation and a water commission. It actually took 9 years for the legislature to actually pass the water code after it was mandated to do so. That's been incorporated into laws, Hawaii Revised Statutes 174C. A significant part of our water code, though, is not unique to Hawaii. And I was working for a number of years before I knew this. There was a model water code which was developed, and the state actually and the legislature took that and then modified it to Hawaii conditions in their negotiations over 9 years to develop Hawaii's water code. So how does it describe hydrologic units in the water code? It's very simple, and there's only 2 parts to it. First of all, it says the Hawaii Water Plan shall divide each county into sections, which shall conform as nearly as practicable to a hydrologic unit. And then in the definition section of the code, it says hydrologic units are defined as a surface drainage area or a groundwater basin or a combination of the two. Now, the state has never chosen to create a unit that was a combination of the two. They've created surface water units and groundwater units. How is sustainable yield referred to in the code? There's a mandate for each groundwater unit, a sustainable yield needs to be developed. And sustainable yield is defined in the same definition section, which means the maximum rate at which water may be withdrawn from a water source without impairing the utility or quality of the water source as determined by the commission. It does have an emphasis on extraction. It doesn't mention recharge as a constraint, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So let me step back before we talk about how the commission over the years has chosen to implement sustainable yield and just talk a little bit about the origins of the sustainable yield concept. And here, this is not a deep area of expertise, and I really turn to others, including some people who might be on this call, to add or even correct what I have to say. Safe yield is often in the literature pointed to in an article by Lee from 1915 as the first attempt to define how much water could be over a long term extracted from a groundwater resource. And then over the years, there's been a number of overlapping and distinctive definitions given for that and related terms, including the terms safe yield, sustainable yield, managed yield, or sustainable groundwater management. There's a number of excellent reviews of this. I give some of the citations to this. And on one of my last slides, I actually have the full citations to these articles. This map that you're seeing in the background, by the way, is the most recent version of a map of the hydrologic units on the island of Oahu and the sustainable yields. In the course of the development of all these terms, however, there is a general acknowledgement, and this appears throughout the literature, that definitions of sustainable yield or safe yield that relate the level of recharge to sustainable yield are generally acknowledged to embody what's called the water budget myth. And really briefly, the water budget myth is that to determine the particular sustainability of an individual well, as it turns out, when you do the mathematical analysis, recharge does not play a meaningful role. There's other factors that play a meaningful role. Recharge is certainly important to know the general characteristics of an aquifer, but it falls apart in determining whether or not an individual well is sustainable. Sustainable yield, incidentally, was not referenced in the model water code. I don't know, I've never delved enough into the legislative history of those 9 years of negotiation of the passage to know how it was incorporated into Hawaii's water code. I'm going to share a diagram from L. Shaw's 2020 paper that I found very useful that relates these terms to each other. And sort of in a nested diagram, safe yield is just really focused on pumping, whereas the farther you go out in the box, the more you start to be concerned about not just the impacts of pumping on a well itself and the capture of water, but on other impacts from pumping. And so in some ways, you might think of today's talk as simply a case study on how we might move from inside the most inner levels of this box to slightly larger levels in managing water in Hawaii. The way that sustainable yield and hydrologic units are actually implemented is through the Hawaii Water Plan, which is a single plan that's developed by different parties and a bunch of different components. There's a water resources protection plan that lays out sustainable yields and hydrologic units that's developed by the Water Commission, a water quality plan that's developed by the Department of Health, a state water projects plan, which allocates for known state needs, that's developed by the land division or the engineering division of the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Department of Agriculture is responsible for developing an agricultural water use and development plan. And then this is all supposed to come together in county water use and development plans. There's a document called a framework for updating the Hawaii water plan that the commission passed over 2 decades ago. And one aspect of that framework is that it left a huge amount of discretion to the counties on how to develop their water use and development plans. So the water use and development plans that we have in Hawaii vary very significantly. On Hawaii Island, it is a very simple, almost a mathematical equation. Is sustainable yield greater than our future demands? If so, that's the end of our analysis. On the parts of the island of Maui, on what's going on right now on Molokai, on most of Oahu that's gone through this, they go into much greater levels of community engagement, trying to have discussions about all the community's interests in water that exist in that area, surface and ground, and for all sorts of uses. So how are boundaries set up in the Water Resources Protection Plan? There's been 3 editions of it. It's supposed to be updated every 5 years, but it is a lot of work. 1990 was the first edition. There was a 2008 update and a 2019 update. Generally, hydrologic boundaries were drawn to follow superficial features. In other words, what you can see from above, not necessarily actual geology and hydrology below. So as a result of that, some of the units vary really significantly in size. The units on Oahu are way smaller than the units on Hawaii Island or Maui. And the goal that they're clear about, and this is a quote from the 2019 Water Resources Protection Plan, the goal was not actually to exactly match what the code asked for, which was discrete hydrologic units, but they set the goal as the simplest method for optimizing development of the island's groundwater resources while ensuring long-term sustainability from a planning and regulatory perspective. So it's just important to understand the units don't actually represent hydrologic reality in almost any place of the islands. That leads us to sustainable yield, which are set for each hydrologic unit. The 1990 plan began the use of using RAM, or the Robust Analytical Model, to calculate sustainable yield. That process was generally followed in the 2008 and 2019 updates. In the current version of the plan, which you can download from the Water Commission's website, there's table F10. It's where the meat of the matter is. And there's tons of footnotes that specifically describe exactly the sources of data that were used, whether it was RAM, RAM2, or other information to determine the sustainable yield for a particular aquifer. But in most cases, it is highly dependent on RAM. So what is RAM? And again, I apologize to you modelers and to you hydrologists who are like, I do not believe I'm sitting here right after lunch listening to a non-hydrologist explain RAM. But there you go. Some people on the call don't know it. It was first provided for by John Mink in 1980 in the study for the Home Rule Board of Water Supply. And it's, while I know you're not supposed to put equations up on the screen, it's a fairly simple equation. Sustainable yield is a percentage of recharge, specifically on a basal aquifer, which this assumes all the aquifers that are measured using RAM or set sustainable yields for aquifers using RAM are all basal aquifers, freshwater floating on saltwater. You have an original head before any wells are put in, and then a level at which you don't want to go below to avoid saltwater intrusion into your well. And so you take a ratio of that new head to the initial head, you square it, subtract it from 1, multiply it by the recharge, and you get your sustainable yield. And as a really simple and just for math easy example, let's assume we have an aquifer with a 10 million gallon a day recharge. You don't want to draw the new head after you developed it below 7.5 feet, and the initial head was at 10. You plug the numbers in, and you basically get sustainable yield is going to be 44% of recharge. So if our sustainable, if our recharge was 10 million gallons a day, our sustainable yield is 4.4 million gallons a day. The other thing that the Water Commission does is they round the numbers. So if it's 0.6, they round up. If it's 0.4, they round down. So the seaworm would say the sustainable yield for this particular aquifer is 4 million gallons a day. RAM2 is an improvement and sophistication of that model. From Liu, who I think I've seen come into the call, so I'd love to hear from him during the Q&A in 2007. It takes the flow submodel of RAM and adds a salinity transport model. It's still because RAM's a core part of the equation, heavily recharge dependent. So what are the goals of RAM? John Mink and others who've written about RAM and use it, what is the goal of RAM? The goal of RAM is to maximize water withdrawal and also prevent saltwater intrusion on an aquifer-wide basis. That's it. So when we say what sustainable yield is, when it's a RAM-based thing, we're talking about sustaining that. Just a side note here before I move on, I want to note how different, and this is sort of illustrative of some of the problems of regulating surface and groundwater differently. The Water Commission sets interim in-stream flow standards, or IIFSs, to protect stream flow in the state. They set those for surface water and sustainable yields for groundwater. Interim in-stream flow standards begin with the premise that streams need water. So they identify what are the minimum amounts of water that we absolutely need in the stream to protect public trust and other key uses. Sustainable yield reverses that. It turns it on its head. It's practiced by the opposite. How much water can we extract from the aquifer? Now, all of this, the setting of hydrologic units, boundaries, and the use of the setting of sustainable yield using RAM and RAM2 interact in important ways with other policy decisions made by the Water Commission over the years. One thing is well construction standards that are established by the Water Commission. Those, among the things that they regulate how deep a well can go into an aquifer to try and get to that RAM assumption that wells are going to be optimally placed. They also require, at a maximum for the largest wells and for municipal wells, a 96-hour or a 4-day pump test. Now, for determining whether or not a well will successfully produce water, 96 hours might be a good amount of time to test. If there is a public trust use of water that might be impacted by a well that is any distance away, 96 hours is insufficient time to figure out whether or not there's going to be an impact from that well on that public trust resource. The practice, which I've talked about before, of having well construction and pump installation permits treated as ministerial, is an issue as well, because that gives up the chance for most people in the public to comment on those permits or have any say in whether or not they think there's something that they want to see sustained that will be impacted. And finally, the last key decision that the Water Commission has made over the years, and they've not made it always the same way over the years, is in the designation process of how do you get from a water hydrologic unit from being undesignated to becoming designated, how they treat criterion 1. Criterion 1 laid out in the water code is what's often called the 90% rule, whether the planned use or the existing use of water in a unit is going to equal 90% or more of the sustainable yield for the area. So the interpretation, particularly the interpretation that's sometimes used, that you have to be at 90% before you designate an area, and we're not going to review permits unless you're in a designated area, means it takes sustainable yield from what it really was designed to do, the maximum possible use under ideal conditions, and turns it into a barrier to sustainable management. Now, I don't want to come across as excessively critical, because I actually do admire a huge amount of the work that the Water Commission staff and commissioners have done over the years. And one of the things I admire is that they're very straightforward, that RAM has some significant limits to it. And they list these out. I'm going to sort of whip through these because most of the people here on this call already know. These are quotes directly from the Water Resources Protection Plan or summaries of statements that they make. RAM assumes freshwater occurs as a basal lens floating on top of seawater. We know that's not true. There's all sorts of different water sources. There's a sharp interface. The aquifer is unconfined. The aquifer is homogeneous. Thickness is constant. Groundwater flow is uniform and laminar. Wells are optimally placed. RAM ignores those spatial distribution of recharge. It ignores the spatial distribution of actual well placement and pumpage. Initial heads were estimated due to a lack of data, and it doesn't account for convection and dispersion. With all of those limits, RAM does a number of things well. It is super easy to understand. It is easy to understand whether 3 is less or greater than 5, and that's super powerful for decision makers to understand things. It's applicable without a lot of data for an area. You just need to have some reasonable estimates of recharge. It works really well as an initial bookend for the possible sustainable development of a resource. In combination with other practices, if your main interest is how can we maximize the amount of water development we have in Hawaii, It actually works to support that. And it really deserves note and recognition that there's a lot of jurisdictions in the US and elsewhere where they've set sustainable yield at recharge. If you want to know that things that are not sustainable, and because you can't possibly ever capture every drop of recharge, it's jurisdictions like Utah and Arizona that have set sustainable yield at recharge. We do far better than that. With that said, there's some limits. Even if RAM is working perfectly, remember, not only are you going to shrink when you develop a basal aquifer along the coast, not only are you going to shrink its height, you're going to shrink its boundaries. So if you happen to have a fish pond or an ancholine pool or something else near the coast, those pools might dry up, fish pond depths might get shallower, salinity is going to increase, and the rate of groundwater flow into those areas is going to decrease, just as a simple matter of hydrology. But there's other limits as well. And this is the core of my presentation. For me, and it took my writing chapter 6 of my book and really having to sit down and understand how we manage groundwater to understand the decision on what is to be sustained that's embedded in the RAM determined sustainable yield as the only thing we're really trying to sustain is wells, is too narrow for all the things that we're supposed to sustain. And it doesn't include enough people in the discussion of what it is that we want to sustain. We also know that it's possible for harm to public trust uses and even to wells to occur at pumping levels well below 90%. In the Keoho aquifer, which I'll talk about later, there was an early decision to do a huge well in the relatively thin basal lens, and it is so salty they're not getting anywhere near the amount of pumping that they want from it. And that's not the only place in Hawaii that that's occurred. There's fundamentally a lack of protection of public trust uses of water when applying RAM informed sustainable yield, and particularly in combination with a rigid application of the 90% rule for designation and with the ministerial permits of treatment of other permits, there's a lack of public trust beneficiaries to weigh in on how water is developed and possibly impacting sustainability for the things that they care about. Beyond that, there's also not a protection for desirable non-public trust uses. So affordable housing isn't listed as a public trust use of water, but it's certainly something those of us who either were born here or have chosen to live here care about greatly. There's no particular protection in the water code and the application of these things to make sure that, hey, we at least get water for our homes first, right? Before we provide for something else. So that's the second part. And the third and fourth parts of my talk are briefer, and I hope to have enough time, even though we started a few minutes in, for some discussions. I'm going to take you through 2 and hopefully 3 places where there's ongoing discussion over what's the correct sustainable yield for this area: West Maui, Keho, Hawaii Island, and Molokai. I'm going to start in West Maui. And this photo, Bishop Museum Ray Jerome Baker photo, is of Moku'ula and Mokuhinia, which, if you don't know of, in Lahaina in the 1800s, and for many hundreds of years before that, it was an island in the middle of a fish pond, and it was the seat of the monarchy in the 1820s and 30s up to 1840s until the capital was moved to Honolulu. In Mokuhinia, into the fish pond, there lived a god, water deity, Kihavahine. And slowly, though, with the development of urbanization slightly, but mostly sugar by Pioneer Mill, this pond that was fed by both surface and groundwater was dried up and eventually was filled in by the county of Maui and turned into a baseball field. So if you go today, now this is despite, even in the 1850s, there was a chant that was composed, E ho'i kanani I Moku'ula, let the glory of Moku'ula be restored. But if you go today, you go to an important community center, the only remaining visible groundwater is in this ditch right outside the center between it and the historical boundaries of Moku'ula and Mokuhinia. And this is a Google map view in this part of the center. This is the now abandoned baseball field. There's been not every year, but some consistent and strong desires to restore this area to its political, cultural, and natural significance. So with that said, is this considered in management of groundwater in West Maui? I've put up some really long quotes, and the video will be shared after this talk, so I'm not going to read through them all, but briefly, in environmental assessments in West Maui, Many of the assessments treat sustainable yield as a simple equation. Oh, we're sustainable as long as we don't pump more than the sustainable yield. There is no significant impacts to the aquifer as long as we don't pump more than sustainable yield. Some of that is echoed in the county's water use and development plan, which is still in draft form for Maui Island. They say, oh, you know, high level, as long as we're pumping below sustainable yield, we're sustainable. That said, the water use and development plan for Maui does acknowledge that groundwater may interact with streams. Development costs and risk might reduce the potential for full development, optimal development of an aquifer. While seaworm sustainable yields are conservative, we don't recommend development up to 100%. Even with those cautions, the adoption of the county's water use and development plan for Maui Island has been controversial, and many people talk about sustainable yield and the things they want to sustain during that debate. So just three quotes, two from a news article, one from a council hearing on it. So Megan Loomis Powers of Huelo, which is in East Maui, she talks basically like, I want this plan to talk about for my area, which is East Maui, not West Maui, that I'm talking about, like, how are we talking about the health of the watershed? What kind of effect will this have on the watershed? There needs to be equity in our distribution of water. Lucienne Dene of Maui Tomorrow highlights, you know, we're proposing taking water from the Ko'olau region that I live in and putting it into the central Maui service system, spending $100 million to drill wells before, because there's a belief that a certain amount of water is available under the sustainable yield. Other members of the community on Maui are saying, no, I think this is a great idea. But again, turning to the idea of sustainable yield, you know, there's a humble estimate of 30 million gallons a day available in this area. You know, we might take 9 million gallons a day right now to help the Iao aquifer, which is being tapped at 90% of its sustainable yield. That's what's the beauty in this plan. So we're in this part of Maui and across Maui, we're having these discussions about what is the right sustainable yield? Is this the right amount? Should it be lowered? Should it be higher? How are we doing it? Some of these discussions of sustainable yield, the point I'm trying to make, lead to assumptions about what's being sustained. Many of the people who are talking about what the sustainable yield is don't necessarily understand the limits and how sustainable yield is applied, what it does protect and what it doesn't protect, and the things that they're asking to protect are not necessarily getting protected. The second example I'll talk about, and I've been deeply involved in this. This is a photo of Koloko Fish Pond within Koloko Honokohau National Historical Park on the west coast of Hawaii Island. And this is during a fish pond work day where people have been removing alien pickleweed, and you're seeing actually springs flow more and really gush up at times into the fish pond. This area became a national park through a very unusual process, perhaps a unique process. It was not a state or federal official who decided that this area should be a park, but it was actually the Kona Hawaiian Civic Club became concerned with plans to develop this area. And they turned to people and lobbied to try and have this area protected. And in the context of this seminar, they turned to John Mink's wife, Patsy Mink, US Representative Patsy Mink, for help, and said, we really want this area to be protected by the National Park Service to protect these important resources that are here and that are being threatened with development. It's a place with not just a couple large fish ponds, but also fish traps, important nearshore environment, about a quarter of all the ancholine pools in West Hawaii, as well as the fish ponds. And so Patsy Mink appointed a committee of really famous and esteemed Native Hawaiians, including Iolani Luahine and George Napiahi, who's known as the founder of the Merry Monarch Festival, and others who held hearings all around Hawaii and developed a report to Congress in 1974 called the Spirit Report. And they recounted what they learned through all their research. And one of the things they learned is that, like, for this place, water was the most important thing. And their belief was that the ancient Hawaiians who settled in the area recognized that even though they could only see some brackish pools, they knew that meant there was a large and productive aquifer below them that could provide for their needs. Now, I've been involved, and so I'm a consultant. You can say, hey, this is just Urilla's an advocate, but I've been involved for over a decade trying to work to protect Molokai groundwater flow in these areas. For 10 years before I was involved, there were discussions held at the Kona Water Roundtable and other venues over water issues in this area. Finally, the National Park Service made up a decision to petition to designate a water management area of the Keaho Aquifer in September 13th. And one of the major points that was made in the petition was sustainable yield as it's practiced doesn't actually protect the park's resources. So we want this tool to comment on just the wells that will really impact us. After 4 years, 3.5 years of effort, the Water Commission rejected the petition on February 14th, Valentine's Day of 2017. But they did acknowledge that and one of the things they said was, you know what, this is not the right venue for talking about sustainable yield and its limits. It should be discussed in the Water Resources Protection Plan. So then in the 2019 update to the Water Resources Protection Plan, they kept the same sustainable yield, but they acknowledged that sustainable yield does not explicitly protect for groundwater dependent ecosystems and asked for the development of an adaptive management plan for the park's resources as a pilot project, which unfortunately still hasn't been done. But how is sustainable yield being talked about even now in EAs, in environmental review documents, the kind of documents that come in front of, say, the Land Use Commission? This is a quote from a recent EA for Ota well, a well being developed for some state desires. As noted above, a recent study by the USGS using more sophisticated methods estimates the recharge rate at 152 million gallons a day. This, together with now proven existence of high-level groundwater, the actual sustainable yield is considerably greater than 38 million gallons a day. So despite the fact that it's the state that sets sustainable yields, they're saying, well, we think that the sustainable yield, what we could withdraw as an outer limit, is greater than that. That was from Planning Solutions. This came up in front of this seminar, in fact, in some of the related media with the discovery of offshore water, which of course was actually culturally known about and historically known about. But to quote Dr. Atias, he says our findings provide a paradigm shift from the conventional hydrological conceptual models that have been vastly used by multiple studies and water organizations in Hawaii and other volcanic islands to calculate sustainable yields and aquifer storage for the last 30 years. Now, the research that did this is good, though I would say that there's perhaps a disconnect between thinking that a new understanding of the aquifer would lead to a new sustainable yield. The Water Commission acknowledges they apply the sustainable yield formula in all sorts of areas with all sorts of different aquifers. I'm not sure the discovery that there's an additional aquifer is going to change the way the state sets sustainable yields. In the water use and development plan, for a specific plan that was developed for this water use, for this area, they focus entirely on the criteria, how current pumping relates to designation. And they say, well, groundwater pumpage won't be above 90% of sustainable yield. So we're able to meet all our demands. And there, by and large, the analysis ends. So what's happening in these Keaho discussions about sustainable yield? Discussions over it should be higher, it should be lower, kind of miss the point of what some members of the community are advocating for. The resources that local people and frankly Congress identified as important are things that should be sustained. We all recognize that they're not. We should recognize that under the existing management regime, with no ability to clear ability to regulate the amount of water extracted from places that will directly impact the park, don't sustain those resources that people find important. So in this case, while sustainable yield, whether it's 38 or higher or lower, might set an outer limit in conjunction with other policies, it doesn't actually protect the things that people want to sustain. I have a third area that I want to talk about in sustainable yield on Molokai. And I know we have some Molokai people on the phone. Really briefly, there's been 30 years plus of litigation and fighting over groundwater on Molokai, particularly related to, is there enough water for DHHL? Is there enough water for traditional and customary practices? And there's enough water for some small additional local domestic uses. Is there enough water for economic development? Molokai does better when they talk about sustainable yields in the EAs. They're actually much more sophisticated about it. I think people who are putting in, this is a quote from the unsuccessful EIS for La'au Point. They talk about sustainable yield and aquifers in a much more nuanced way. In litigation, which is sometimes how people say hi on the island of Molokai, I joke, but there's been a lot of fighting by very smart people on water on the island. And so the Supreme Court in the Waiolo Molokai case relied on this. And they said, several Native Hawaiians testified they have a religious and spiritual relationship to the land and water areas and a commitment to Lamaka Aina, which requires protecting natural ecosystems from desecration and deprivation of its freshwater natural resources. I'll just note there were no Okina or Kahako in the Supreme Court opinion. The Molokai Water Use and Development Plan is being developed right now. And there's some actually really great and sophisticated discussions by this very knowledgeable community about wanting to understand what's the sustainable yield? Could we have a cultural sustainable yield? Is this really protecting the things along the coast, the fish ponds and nearshore environment that we really care about and we subsist on? So unlike Keauhou and unlike West Maui, there's a higher level of knowledge of sustainable yield and its limitations. But the regulatory system isn't really currently set up to allow for this community to manage sustainably the resources that they want to manage sustainably. So what do we do? What I said I was trying to set out to do was to make an argument that sustainable yields that are set using the robust analytical model are useful as our far outer limit of overall consumption, but we need to become much better at recognizing more uses that need to be sustained and that more people need to be involved in our discussions of what it is to sustain. And then we need to bring to bear better modeling, planning, and policies. I throw this out as a potential possible definition that could be incorporated into plans that define sustainable yield. It's not just the maximum you can withdraw, but it should be the maximum amount of water that can be reasonably and beneficially used after public trust uses of water are satisfied. That would bring the definition more into line with how in-stream flow standards are set. There's some things that we don't have to go to every community in Hawaii to ask about to protect. Public trust uses, water for established protected areas. But in areas where we want to go deeper, the county water use and development plans, rather than being broad, whatever you want to do, if there was some clear guidance that said, you need to engage with community, you need to engage with what are the water resources in your area that you want to sustain, it could bring us to a point of not just protecting wells, which we absolutely want to sustain, but protecting other things that are important to us. And for that, we will really need interdisciplinary teams of planners, modelers, and the community to engage in the process. Last thing I'm going to do, and I know there's only 6 minutes left, is just to throw up a quote from the end of The Queen's Story by Liliuokalani, which I often think about when I think about groundwater and how we manage it. The way to lose any earthly kingdom is to be inflexible, intolerant, and prejudicial. Another way is to be too flexible, tolerant of too many wrongs, and without judgment at all. It is a razor's edge, it is the width of a blade of peely grass. To gain the kingdom of heaven is to hear what is not said, to see what cannot be seen, and to know what is unknowable. When we manage groundwater, we're trying to see what we cannot see and know what we cannot know. So we want to do so, if we can, with not being too flexible, not being inflexible, and with aloha, which is of course not weakness, but with this aloha for the land that we are home to and love. With that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and thank everybody for my slightly too long talk and everyone's attention.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a really excellent talk. Before I get to the few questions in the chat, so I want to make sure there was some interest in the recording of this talk. So for those not aware, this talk has been recorded and it will be made available on our website, which we will post in the chat and within 2 to 4 weeks after it receives approval from the speaker and it meets ADA compliance. So please check the website periodically to see if it's made available. And going on to the questions in the chat. Oh, one more thing before I get to that. Jonathan, would you mind putting your email or making your email available in case people want to follow up?
Please, absolutely. Yeah, that's great.
All right, so there was one comment from Clark Liu about the RAM. Clark, if you would want to come turn your audio on and make your comment, or I can read it out for you.
Yes, maybe I can say it over here. My comment is Jonathan mentioned about run and run 2. My comment is that the only difference between the two is that the equilibrium head is determined by run by empirically, and empirical head is determined analytically by run 2. This is my comment. Do I have time to make another quick comment? Or,
I would love to hear it.
Okay, Johnson, I'd like to make another quick comment, maybe a little off, because I try to understand everything you said. I think it's great in water management area, we consider to start with a public trust purposes. I fully agree with that. But my comment, the second point I'd like to make is sustainable yield, which has been determined by RUN model, only consider part of the public trust. So in other words, my vision is that if we consider other public trust purposes, the possibility is that eventually it will lower the estimate sustainable yield rather than to increase it. Maybe I'm wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your decades of work for Hawaii's water resources. The consistent practice of the Water Commission, I think in almost all cases, has never been to raise sustainable yield. It has been to lower it over time. So, Aurora or Carrie, are you moderating the next Q&A to the degree we have time for things?
So we have perhaps one more question. There was one left in the chat by Alex Leonard. I think that'll be the last question we can take in the live Q&A.
I'd like to say something Paul Ayer would like to say after that.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I think we can give Paul a chance to say something after that last question. So just go ahead with the last question, and then we'll give a chance for Paul to say something.
Great. Okay, Alex Leonard, you had a question if you want to say it, or I can.
Yeah. Jonathan, Alex Leonard from the Natural Energy Lab here.
Hi, how are you?
I really appreciate your presentation, and I totally concur with many of your fundamental principles here and concepts. I agree with you on a lot of stuff, but I do ask the question: how do we support the statement that adherence to whatever our current system is doesn't sustain the needs of what needs to be sustained right now in the Keoho aquifer? The fact that the Park Service may make that statement doesn't necessarily make it so. And so I'm asking for support for the statement that says that what needs to be sustained isn't currently being sustained.
So I absolutely agree. Just because the Park Service says something, it doesn't make it so. There's more time than we have to get into the way in which changes to the aquifer immediately below the park have been measured and analyses that have been done on those. I'm confident that you're actually seeing some changes to water flow within the park, but even that, to move from the park's particular concerns around Koloko Honokohau, when I was asked to do for the Water Commission report on the impact on traditional and customary practices in the aquifer, we had native testimony from around Kahalu that was like, yeah, when I was growing up, we had all these resources. They turned the wells on, those resources went away. For DHHL, it's a struggle to get water, which is another public trust use of water. So that's some of the bases for my statement, for the evidence behind my statement. But I really appreciate the question, Alex, and I 100% agree. Just because NPS or anybody says something, that doesn't make it true. Thank you so much. Mr. Ayer.
Mr. Shoyer, you're a hard man to go up against. But let me say this. I believe you're trying to improve the conditions of the Hawaiian people and the Hawaiian environment. But I don't believe you fully understand the complexity of the issue or the actual impacts of the things you're proposing. Let me say, leaving 50% more of the groundwater of the recharge, leaving more than 50% of the recharge in the ground to take its natural paths, more than satisfies the precautionary principle. And I fear that your approach will drive the objective approach, the scientific approach, whether you want to use RAM or anything else. The most important part of that equation is recharge. And the efforts that have been put into calculating recharge have been tremendous. And I think, anyway, so recharge is the most important thing. 50% of that we're letting go. The commission lets the water code allows to follow its natural path. So I fear that your approach will drive the objective approach that we take now into the political realm. Politicians, lawyers, and developers will all be considering only the short term. I'm afraid at the expense of the long-term sustainability that you want to see, that I think what we're doing now is fairly good at doing, but I'm afraid of the consequences of your approach. Thank you.
I think it's more of a statement, Paul. So I guess
Yes,
thanks for your statement.
It was a statement. It was a statement. That was the statement I wanted to make in response to yours.
Thank you.
No comment?
Oh, so it's a statement, but you would like me to respond to it. So on any individual area, the water budget myth is that recharge has a bearing on whether something is sustainable or not. And that's well established in the hydrologic literature.
No, it's not.
Well, we will disagree on that then, won't we?
No, I will show you why what I'm saying is true.
Okay, maybe you could be invited to do a presentation
Okay.
on the seminar series. Aurora or Tom or Carrie?
Okay, well, it looks like we're running out of time, so I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much again, Jonathan, for presenting. And I'd like to invite Tom to give any final comments.
Yep. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks for hosting this, and thanks to you and Aurora for coordinating the seminar series this semester and doing a great job of it. Thanks to April and Pat for doing the logistics and making sure we all know when the seminars are going to be on. And really, I want to thank especially Jonathan. Great job. I really enjoyed the talk and learned a lot, and appreciate your insights. And thanks to everybody who tuned in to this. We really had a great attendance at this seminar. I'm really pleased to see that. So thanks, everyone.